everyone, welcome back to my channel. This is Heidi from My Reading Life, and I'm here today to film my best reads of 2022 video for fiction. So these are the fiction titles that I think are the best books that I read this year. They're not, they're best by my own standards. They're not books that were published in 22 necessarily. They're just books that I read in 2022 and I really enjoyed or I loved. And so these are the top 8 books that I read, top 8 novels that I read in 2022. So let's just get started. I've sort of categorized them to make it easier for myself. And so the very first book is the biggest surprise that I had last year, and that was Razorblade Tears by S.A. Crosby. I read this as an ebook, and I'd had it on my Kindle for a while, and I'd heard lots of good things about S.A. Crosby, but I had not read any of his books. And so I picked it up on my vacation last spring, and I just could not put this book down. It is a suspense novel. It's a novel of 2 fathers whose sons are killed, and one is black and one is white. And the 2 dads have a very colorful past, shall we say. They have not been very good people in their lives. They have been in trouble with the law, and they had their 2 sons had met and fallen in love and gotten married, and the 2 dads could not accept that. And so their 2 children get killed, and they decide to take on the job of hunting down their killers and bringing them to justice, because they feel the system is not providing justice on its own. It is a rip-roaring, completely violent, but very good read. Like, the 2 main characters are just so compelling. Their relationship as they first concoct this plan to achieve justice for their sons, and then we learn sort of the backstory, and then we follow them on this quest. It is just a rip-roaring good story, and I highly recommend it. The second book I want to talk about is the best book that I read off my bucket list. So I've been reading books off my bucket list that I put together when I did the Mooks and the Gripes bucket list book tag back quite a while ago. And the best book that I read off that list this year was A Gentleman in Moscow. This is historical fiction written by Amor Towles, and it's been very popular on BookTube, so I probably don't need to go over it very much. But it's basically about this count who, in the early 1900s in Russia, is part of the elite, and so is confined to a hotel in Moscow, or on threat of, if he leaves the hotel, he will be killed by the new government, because he is part of the old regime, and he is going to be allowed to live in this hotel, live out his life in this hotel, and as long as he doesn't leave the hotel. And so it's all about this guy stuck in this hotel, and through his telling of his own life story, we sort of see the history of Russia during the 20th century. And you might think that that sounds like it wouldn't be very interesting, but it was such a good book. The characters in the hotel, this life that he builds in this very constricted location, things that happen to him that are unexpected and that I don't want to go into for fear of spoiling it. I've heard the criticism that it's a slow read. And it is slow in that it is just one person's life, and one person's life lived through sort of the lens of the history of a country. But I just found it really compelling. The character of the Count was so charming. The other characters in the hotel that he interacts with and basically builds a family with are just great. And I just really, really loved it. Number 3 is the best horror book with heart that I read in 2022. So I read... I read If It Bleeds by Stephen King. I have this copy. I forgot to show you that I actually have a copy of A Gentleman in Moscow, but there it is. I forgot I had this stack over here, so we're just gonna go with it. The best horror with heart that I read in 2022 is If It Bleeds by Stephen King. This is a collection of 4 novellas, and it is probably classified as horror. It does have some sort of scary, spooky elements to it, but I would say this is more a book about human nature and how humans react to different things that happen to them. But he, of course, builds in supernatural elements, some horrific elements. I did not find this book really very scary at all, but I found it to be really good character stories, really good exploration of human foibles and like human typical reactions to things. And I just love how Stephen King writes his characters. I just think he can tell a really good story. And when he's constrained to shorter fiction, I think he's even more successful than when he writes his longer novels, because he really keeps the storyline together, and he doesn't sort of go off on tangents the way that he's prone to do in his longer fiction. So if you're interested in trying Stephen King, I would definitely recommend for you to check out his shorter fiction. And this particular collection I thought was very, very good. Then the next book, number 4, is the best romance book that I read this year. And this was Book Lovers by Emily Henry. This was the year in which I discovered Emily Henry. I read all 3 of her currently published novels in 2022. But my favorite of the bunch was Book Lovers. I really love this contemporary romance story. It shouldn't work for me because it basically takes all the tropes of a Hallmark romance movie and dumps it into one book. But I loved it. I thought it was so charming, so cute. The main characters are both in the book industry. The young woman, very focused on her career, and she ends up leaving. She's a city girl, but she ends up going from the city into the country for family reasons. And of course, also in the same small town is her nemesis, a man that she had met through the course of her work and had not gotten along with. And now they're stuck together in the same small town, and of course, shenanigans ensue. It has all the tropes that you would expect of city people in the country, and I just found it really delightful and really fun. And watching their relationship develop was great. Also, their family connections, each of the guy and the girl, the main characters, who I'm not remembering their names, but each of their family side stories were very interesting and enjoyable. So yeah, I just really loved Book Lovers by Emily Henry. Then number 5 is best historical fiction that I read in 2022, and that was Small Island by Andrea Levy. Andrea Levy is a author with Caribbean heritage, and this story tells the tale of 2 characters from Jamaica who end up in England after World War II, living in a boarding home with run by a white woman. And so we're following these 3 main characters, plus the woman who owns the boarding house. Her husband's off at war still, but through sort of flashbacks, we find out about him as well. So the 4 main characters are these 2 couples, the 2 from Jamaica and the 2 from England that are white, the 2 from Jamaica that are black. And it's basically, through these 4 main characters, we see the history of how Black people were treated in England during and directly after World War II. And it was just such a great story. The characters are excellent. Andrea Levy knows how to tell a story. I loved the 2 timelines and how they were woven together. I thought that was really successful. But basically what was the strongest element of the story were the characters, because they were just fantastic. So yeah, if you're looking for historical fiction, particularly about that time period during and after World War II, the sort of Windrush generation in England, I'm really fascinated with that time period, and I want to read more about it. But I really, really enjoyed Small Island by Andrea Levy. Then number 6, the best book that came into my life unexpectedly, because it was a book that my niece said, I read this book and I really loved it, and I think you should read it too because I think you'll like it. So I did, and that book was A Rip Through Time by Kelly Armstrong. So this book is a historical mystery for the most part, although there is a time travel element involved. So our main character is she's a police detective in present day Canada. She goes over to Scotland to visit her grandmother, and while she is there, she slips through time and winds up in Edinburgh, Scotland during the mid 1800s. And she's not in her own body anymore. When she wakes up in the 1800s, she's in the body of a maid, and the maid works in the household of a doctor. And the doctor is involved in studying forensic science. He is looking at dead bodies and trying to tell what crimes were committed against those bodies by his research. And so it's a very brand new science. And she gets involved in his work because, of course, she's a police detective back in the 21st century. He doesn't know that. He thinks she's just a maid. But it's her trying to help him solve a mystery without him finding out that she's not from his time. And this woman trying to take her 21st century personality and shove it into an 1800s maid's personality was such a great story. It really was a page turner. I love the feminist aspects of it. I love this exploration of the changes in women's roles over time and how that would impact you if you were suddenly thrust back in history, back in time, and had to take your current modern day personality and character and things that you believe and know and try to make that work in a time period where you didn't have the sort of freedoms that you had in your normal timeline. So I really like that. Plus the mystery was super interesting as well, because maybe when she slipped through time, a serial killer came with her. And so she's trying to figure out if that's the case, and it's just a really ripping good read. So A Rip Through Time by Kelly Armstrong. Excellent read. And one that was a surprise because I didn't know about the book until my niece recommended it to me. Then number 7 is best short story collection that I read last year. And I don't read a lot of short story collections, but I read Night of the Living Rez by Morgan Talty last year as a buddy read with Sean the Book Maniac. We read it slowly, one story a week over many weeks. I think it took us 12 weeks to read all of the stories, something like that. It took us definitely 3 months to read the book. And it is a connected group of stories that, when put together, tells the story of one particular family in the Penobscot Reservation in Maine. And this indigenous family, we see them in different time periods through the main character. The son of the family is telling all of these stories, David. And David, so we see David as a very small child, we see him as a teenager, we see him as a young adult, and the timelines are all interwoven together, where it's not a chronological order in terms of the stories, how the stories are laid out. And so as each story builds on the one before it, you start to get a complete picture of this family and of this community in Maine, and what it's like to live as an indigenous person. The stories are told, like the time frame is basically modern day, I would say, and it's all about, sort of family trauma and what it's like to grow up in an indigenous community, and what the white community has sort of done to create constrictions around what can happen if you're an indigenous person. It is, there are sad topics that are dealt with within the book, but it's told with a lot of humor. I think that Morgan Talty does a great job of balancing like the very serious nature of the topics that he's addressing, but told with humor and heart, and you just fall in love with these characters who are just, deeply flawed, but also deeply, you can feel a lot of deep empathy for them, and you really are rooting for them to come through this in one piece. So yeah, I really highly recommend that collection. I think it's great. I think also, Morgan Talty in an interview made the point that he's not speaking for the entire Penobscot Nation. He's speaking for, this one book is one aspect of an experience that might happen in an indigenous community, and that you shouldn't take any individual book written by an indigenous person and sort of extrapolate that out to mean that that's the one experience that exists for indigenous people, or that's the entirety of sort of that culture and that community. And I think that's a really great point. But I do think that Night of the Living Rez is an excellent piece of fiction, and really makes me, again, reminds me that I really love the best short story collections for me are these sort of interconnected collections that build upon one another. I really like that style of short story. And then last but not least, number 8, the best sci-fi that I read was a book that I read on December 31st. I haven't even wrapped this book up yet on the channel, but I read it at the end of the day on December 31st, the last book I read in 2022. It was an absolute home run of a book for me, and that is To Be Taught If Fortunate by Becky Chambers. This is a novella, and it is about a group of people, 4 people I believe, who are on a long-term space mission. It's in the future, set in the future, when humans have perfected the ability to travel through space. The crew of this spaceship have been in stasis for like 14 years or something, and they're waking up to start their work because they are basically exploring new planets. And each of them is a different kind of scientist, and each of the individuals in the party are going to study different aspects of the 4 different planets that they are scheduled to visit on this mission. And so we follow the characters sort of as they wake up and as they find out, they see the communications that have come to them from Earth since they've been on this flight. In 14 years, they've been, in stasis and not communicating with anyone. And then we also get an explanation of what they're exploring, what they're studying, what they're finding. And it is a love letter to science. It is absolutely a love letter to science. There's so much joy in discovery and exploration that is described. This book is also about communication and how important communication is to humans and to human nature, and how we communicate things that we know and don't know, and how we work together and don't work together. There's just so much going on in this very short novella. I've already lent it to my niece for her to read, but it definitely will be a book that I will be rereading in the future. It was such a feel-good story, and it really, it just warmed my heart to read that as the last book of the year. So yeah, definitely the best sci-fi I read last year, To Be Taught If Fortunate by Becky Chambers. So those are the best 8 pieces of fiction that I read in 2022. I hope that some of those books are also your favorites, but if there's any books on that list that you're interested in reading, please let me know. If there are any that you have read and you also enjoyed, please let me know that as well. And I hope you're all doing well in the new year. I will talk to you later.